Hey everyone, welcome back. Dave in History for the Ages here. So something special. I've wanted to do this for a long time. I have a long playlist on the history of Israel. It is hours of content. And I have a lot of short lectures. But what I don't have is a single concise history. And that's what I want to do in this video. From ancient roots to modern marvels, the entire history of Israel that you could sit and watch. And hopefully one sitting, my goal is to make this under an hour. But still shorter than my massive playlist, because I know a lot of people can't sit through 6 hours of content, but they want more than 5-10 minutes. I've been teaching the history of the history for over 29 years. Most of that time, history of the Middle East as a college history professor. For those of you who don't know who I am, and I've loved sharing my lectures, and this is a really important one. I think this will be great for a lot of folks: middle school, high school, college, homeschoolers. If you're a teacher and you need like a time to show something about 45 minutes to a class, we'll see how long this goes. You have that. If you're in a church or a synagogue, if you're even in a company and you want them to learn a little bit about the history of Israel, this is what I want it to be. Kind of, my years of expertise on this, I want to be able to share with you here. And if you really enjoy this and you can really support the channel, that would be awesome, whether it's a one-time like, a membership, merchandise, whatever. But if you just want to enjoy the lecture, that's great too. So we're going to get right into it. Should be a very fun and important topic here. So we'll start from ancient times. And so what you see here are a couple images. You see a map that represents what is roughly the size of ancient Israel, right? Going back to about 1100 BC. And initially, it was what we would call an oligarchy, rule of a few. There were what we call the judges, and they were divided up into 12 tribes. By the year about 1020 BC, we had, of course, a famous individual named Saul who united the 12 tribes into one kingdom. And then about 1000 BC, we had the period of King David. And King David, of course, most famous story of King David, David and Goliath. Now, the story of David and Goliath is, some people say, was there literally a giant that Goliath, that David slayed? Or could it have been more of a figurative story of David defeating the Philistines? The Philistines were an ancient Greek people who were a threat to the Hebrews, and maybe he defeated them. And that could be where that story comes from. Now, one good question I oftentimes get is, was all this stuff real, right? In terms of the ancient materials, David and Solomon, who I'm going to talk about in a second. And, I tell students all the time that you can't just rely on the Bible blindly if you're doing history, right? You have to find other things, archaeological evidence. And so on the bottom here, you have an image of one of the short videos I made on was there a King David? And there was something called the Tel Dan Stele, and we have other archaeological evidence. Again, I have a video on that, and at the end of this, of course, I'm going to put my whole playlist to the history of Israel, and I'll put a whole bunch of things in the description as well, where if you want more detail about any of the time periods I'm talking about, you could do that. But for now, I'm just trying to kind of get through the whole history in like one sitting. So King David, of course, very important. He was followed by Solomon. Now, Solomon, probably his most famous achievement was, of course, building Solomon's temple. Again, I have a video on that, but let me just show you a couple things here. And so Solomon's temple, of course, is with the image, what we believe it looked like is what you see here on the left. And it was built historically as a place of worship, but also a place to house the Ark of the Covenant. Now, one of the things about both David and Solomon, as I told you, yes, we have archaeological evidence that there were things there and built, but, I always like to be as transparent and objective as possible when I do any sort of history lectures. And so one question we do have, and it is a fair question, were these major architectural sites, whether it's Solomon's temple or other things we have done, during the time of King David and Solomon? Because there is dispute on that. While there's no dispute in any real serious circles of a King David and Solomon and a Jewish people living in ancient Hebrew and ancient Israel, there is dispute about when it all happened, because a lot of the stuff we have is carbon dating. And carbon dating that we use, dating back things that far back, have a plus minus. And so the exact years of when these things happened could have been a little earlier, a little later from our carbon dating. But we do know that there was a temple here. And we also know what stands on it today. And if you see the image on the right here, for those of you who don't know what that is, and we'll get to this period as well, this is many, many, many years later, centuries and later, when you have the rise of Islam, you're going to see this building known as the Dome of the Rock. And the Dome of the Rock is going to be built right on top of where Solomon's temple stood. So you had the original Solomon's temple. It's going to be destroyed, and it's going to be rebuilt, and then the second one's going to be destroyed, and I'll talk about all of that as we go through this story here, then you're going to have Solomon's temple built right on top of that. So you could imagine how this today can create a lot of conflict, and this is, of course, in modern-day Jerusalem. And so, you have Jewish people who want to go to what's called the Temple Mount, where you see the Dome of the Rock, and they go, this is, a religious place for us. And they'll get, no, you're not allowed to be here. And so it's that kind of insanity that, and I will use that word, insanity, that, no one should ever have an issue praying anywhere, in my opinion. You want to pray peacefully wherever you want, and no one should tell you no. But the fact that actually happens shows the long, deep issues in this land. But it also shows that, when you build one religious monument on top of another, it's going to create conflicts. Now, is this unique to what happened when a Muslim monument was built on top of Solomon's temple? No, I mean, you could look at other examples when you have in Spain Christian monuments built on top of Muslims, and Cordoba, and all sorts of examples. And you see this oftentimes in history, but it's still problematic. So anyway, so you had Solomon. He builds this big temple. He's got this kingdom. And then what? Well, after Solomon dies, we see a division that's about to take place. And you see on this new map here, two kingdoms, Kingdom of Israel in the north and Kingdom of Judah in the south. And it's the old saying, united we stand, divided we fall. And so the Kingdom of Israel in the north will eventually be conquered by what we call the Assyrians. They dispersed 10 of the tribes, the quote-unquote lost tribes, and they're scattered all about. The kingdom in the south will be conquered by the Babylonians. And this is when you get something known as the Babylonian captivity. The Babylonians will be the ones who destroy Solomon's temple and then capture, well, over about 100,000 probably, we don't know exactly, Jewish inhabitants, and they take them out of Judea, Jerusalem, and take them to Babylon as slaves. Now, one of my other videos that I have, it's about another 10 minutes if you want to watch it, explores how there was always a Jewish presence in this land. The numbers fluctuated, but there was always a Jewish presence there for 3,000 years. So even during this Babylon captivity, there were still some Jewish people left in this region. But this is an important point, because once the kingdom of Israel is conquered by the Assyrians, and then later on the kingdom of Judah conquered by the Babylonians, it really is a pivotal moment when the Jewish people have a long time until they actually have full self-control, full autonomy over this land again, despite the fact of a Jewish presence there. All right, so that's an important part of the ancient history. Now, as we go on, real briefly here, we have the story of the ancient Persians, because after the Assyrians and Babylonians, you have the rise of the ancient Persians. You see this map in green. Everything on this map in green represents territory that the ancient Persians are going to conquer. And of course, you could see they take over what is modern-day Israel again. One very important king was Cyrus in about the mid-500s BC. And Cyrus was the one who vowed the Jewish people to leave Babylon. He was known as being a more tolerant ruler. He said, basically, keep your way of life, keep your religion, keep your customs, just make sure you pay your taxes to me. I have a separate video on him as well, of course. And he lets the Jewish people rebuild their temple. And so that happens during the Persian period. So that's an important moment as well, where the Jewish people are able to come back and rebuild the temple. All right, then we get into probably one of the more darker periods of time for the Jewish people in the history of Israel. And this is the Roman era. So what's the deal with this? When Rome came into being and became a super empire power that spread, of course, from Italy around the Mediterranean Sea and eventually making their way into what is modern-day Israel, The Roman people had a serious issue and problem with the Jewish people, and for that matter, the Christian people. What Judaism and Christianity, of course, share in common is they're both monotheistic religion. And of course, one of the other important points I cover in my longer detailed lectures is, how Christianity, of course, comes out of Judaism. Basically, the big difference between Christianity and Judaism is in Judaism, there's a concept of a Messiah, a Savior. The Jewish people who essentially believed that Christ was that Messiah or Savior became Christians. The ones who didn't, they say he doesn't meet the characteristics, remain Jews. And so that's kind of where you get the big split there. But they're both monotheistic religions. And to the Romans, that was problematic because for Rome, especially during the Roman Empire period, the emperor is the one that needs to be deified after they die. And if you're also an emperor, by definition, if you believe in a monotheistic religion, your top authority is God, not the emperor. So they had problems with the Christians. If you know the story of Nero, I have a separate video on Nero as well if you want to watch. And he, of course, persecuted the Christians. And then for the Romans, several Roman emperors went after the Jews. You had the story of Titus, and I'm going to show you a couple pictures here in a second. But Titus was the one who destroyed the second temple. It's a very somber holiday in Jewish history called Tisha B'Av. I have another video. It's just like 5 minutes on all the Jewish history, all the Jewish holidays. If you want something quick, you can watch that. Tisha B'Av, and that's when the second temple was destroyed. And that was around the year 70 AD. After that, things get worse, and they really get bad during the time of Hadrian. So Hadrian was a powerful Roman emperor, and he ruled around the year 130 AD. And it was Hadrian who decided to put even more pressure on the Jewish people. He, first of all, outlawed circumcision, which, of course, for anybody who knows anything about Jewish traditions and customs and religion, that is one of the core ideas of Judaism. Jewish male babies are circumcised. And he said, you can't do that. And of course, there were destruction of synagogues, and we also saw already, Titus destroying the temple earlier. And so all of this, of course, upset the Jewish people there, which led to a revolt, right? And Shimon bar Kokhba leads this revolt. And this revolt is, unfortunately for the Jewish people, not successful. In fact, according to Roman sources like Cassius Dio, the Romans came in and massacred hundreds of thousands of the Jewish inhabitants in Judea. By now, the population there was massively supportive of Jewish people there. Remember, the Jewish people had still been there, and there was a large number, but about 500,000, according to at least this one source, were murdered by Hadrian. But he didn't just stop with that. So I want you to see what Hadrian does here. He outlaws circumcision. He kills the population, and he destroys the temples, synagogues, and so forth. But then he does one other thing. He renames the land. And this is when he renames the land from Israel, Judea, to Palestine. And the term comes from, again, an ancient Greek term, has nothing to do with what you would think of today as, quote unquote, Palestinians. And so the term and the language and the destruction of the holy sites, all of this circumcision, what is Hadrian doing? He's trying to destroy the Jewish identity. He's trying in many ways to eliminate Jewish people completely. So, and at least this is my way of putting it, I think this is really something that would legitimately be called an attempted genocide, because this is something that he, again, look at the numbers, look what he's trying to do, just the very connection and culture to the Jewish people. However, even despite that, the Jewish people survived, the Jewish people maintained themselves. They, of course, were going to, again, be spread out in parts of the Middle East, parts in Europe, but they did survive even through these horrific things by Hadrian. A few images here. So you see the first two images here on the left are the Arch of Titus. Tradition has it, this is in Rome, in the Forum in Italy, that when you walk underneath, when you go to Rome, if you're Jewish, you don't walk under the Arch of Titus. You're supposed to walk around it. I don't know how well you could see in the close-up here, but you have like the spoils that were taken from Jerusalem. The image on the right is of another story, because I'm trying to have the concise history here and not get into everything, but the story of Masada. If you want more details on all this ancient stuff, in my playlist, I have 2 videos on this, right? So it'll be just a half hour just learning about all of this in more detail. And you learn about Masada and more about what I just talked about with Hadrian and more detail there. So that's all part of the ancient history there, pivotal moment in the history of Israel. All right, so we move on to our next phase, and this is what we call the Islamic period. And by now we're in about 600s AD to about 1800s AD, when this is when you had various Muslim powers that controlled the region. Some names, some terms I'll give you, like the Abbasids, well, first the Umayyads and the Abbasids. Probably the most significant, the long time period is the Ottomans. The Ottomans will be in there from, the Ottomans begin in Asia Minor about the 1300s. Eventually, they'll move into Judea and Israel, and they'll control that territory until basically the end of World War I. So the Ottomans will be, of course, a very important one. Now, when the Muslim forces were in Judea, of course, they are the ones that are going to build the Dome of the Rock, as we talked about before. The treatment of Jewish people there varied, right? And I will also say this: if you were a Jewish person living in the Middle Ages, and you had to pick between living under a Western European power or living in a Muslim power in the Middle East, you were probably better off living in a Muslim power in the Middle East. I think that's just objectively true. I know some people will deny some of that, but and again, now the bar wasn't very high, to be fair too, right? And it doesn't mean Jewish people weren't facing humiliation and forced conversions and restriction of property. It depended on when and who was in charge in the Middle East. But if you look at what was going on in Europe at the time, and the blood libels and the persecutions and things like the various massacres, like during the Black Death, you had the massacre at Strasbourg, where Jews were accused of causing the Black Death and persecuted. I mean, it was just horrid, right? So, you had that issue. So depending on when and where, the Jewish people there were sometimes treated a little better, sometimes worse, but at the end of the day, they again maintained a presence in this land, even though the land was controlled by other various Islamic powers. So this takes us to a big span of time, right? And so what happens now as we get closer to the end of Ottoman rule? So by the 19th century, the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire is kind of known as the sick man of Europe. It's a strong, big civilization, but has been around for a while now, has weakened, and of course things are going to happen which are going to make the Ottomans lose control of this land. Specifically, World War I will be the final straw, but we're going to see more than that. All right, and as that's going to happen, before we get to that moment where that takes place, we now enter the kind of the second half of this video, I would say, right? So the first half of the video was more on the ancient period, and a little bit during the Middle Ages, what was going on there, the Islamic period. What I want to spend the rest of the time here on is as we get into the modern period, and talk about more events that lead to where we are today. But even here, there's a lot of detail. And again, my longer videos, if you see like my videos on the rebirth of Israel, that's where you get into a lot of detail on all this. But before the Ottomans collapsed in the 1800s, we had a very strong movement throughout Europe, something called nationalism. And nationalism, as I tell my student, was the state of mind rising out of an awareness of being part of a community that has common language, culture, tradition, and customs. There are other definitions of nationalism as well, of course. But this was happening all over Europe, where Greece, for example, was under the control of the Ottomans, and the Greeks said, we don't want to be under the control of the Ottomans, we're Greeks. Same thing with the Egyptians. We don't want to be under the Ottoman control. We're Egyptians. It's also why you get countries like Italy formed and Germany formed in the 1800s. Well, there was a nationalistic idea for the Jewish people as well, and that is, of course, the idea of Zionism. And this is, of course, the cornerstone person to help push this was a man named Theodor Herzl. Wrote a document called The Jewish State from Budapest. And, one of the things that drove him was a story of a man named Alfred Dreyfus. It wasn't the only thing. It wasn't like the only catalyst. But if you don't know the story of Alfred Dreyfus, he was basically a Jewish French army officer who was falsely accused of treason in the 1800s. And there was a sham trial and imprisonment. And, it was just so clearly biased against him because he was Jewish. And what Herzl understood, and what many other people understood, that as long as the Jewish people were scattered throughout Europe or the Middle East, they simply were not going to get a fair shake. They were not being treated well. And there's so many examples of that, right? Obviously I mentioned like what happened to the Jews during the Black Death. And, I talked about how in the Middle East, depending on who was in power, they weren't always treated well. I have another video I did on Jews in the Arab world. And this is a story that's personal to me because my parents were Iraqi Jews, and they were Jews who lived in Iraq, and their grandparents lived in Iraq, and everything they had was ripped away from them because they were Jewish people who lived in Iraq. And so there are definitely these tens of incidents and stories, and again in my longer video I give more examples of this problem. And so Herzl and others in 1897 created the first Zionist Congress. The World Zionist Organization was created, and to that end, their goal was to create a Jewish state again for the Jewish people, where Jewish people would control the land. Now, everybody and their mother understood that should be in the modern-day Israel, right? That was where the Jewish people inhabited. There were some other plans. I always throw this one out because students think this is funny a bit. But there was actually some people floated, well, let's put it in Uganda. Let's give the Jewish people a state in Uganda. And of course, pretty much everyone laughed that off. And so Zionism is just that. I have a very important video. It's one of my more popular videos. What is Zionism? And basically, you don't have to be Jewish to be a Zionist, folks. All Zionism is you believe the Jewish people should have a homeland. That homeland should be in modern-day Israel, and you should be able to defend it. If you believe that, congratulations, you're a Zionist. Now, does this mean you have to agree with everything Israel has done? No. Does this mean you can't be critical of policies in Israel? Of course you can be critical of the policies of Israel. Hell, half of Israelis are critical of policies of Israel every given second. But there's a big difference between being critical of policies and being critical of some elements of what Israel does, and saying Israel does not have a right to exist while you believe every other state and nation in the world does. And I think that's one of the corner point that I always tell people. And when people want to have discussions, that's kind of my first question to them. And if they say, no, Israel doesn't have the right to exist, then you're already dealing with people who don't want real conversation. If they say, hey, I think Israel has a right to exist, but I have issues with X, Y, and Z, then I think there's places to talk and discuss and all of that. But unfortunately, I find that group is small in my experiences in academia, at least. All right, so that's Theodor Herzl. This is a quick picture of Alfred Dreyfus, as I mentioned. This is, of course, the guy who was persecuted and was one of these motivator factors, that helped Herzl and others agree, hey, we really need to do something. There's, and so many times people were told, Jews, get out, Jews, get out, Jews, get out. So finally, Jews get out. They go to Israel, and then they're told, we don't want you here. So, of course, just kind of crazy stories. All right, so then what? So then, one more quick picture here. Sorry, this is the burial site of Herzl. If you ever go to Israel, you can go visit it there as well. So just another quick image there. All right, so now what? So Herzl's, of course, in the WZO, they're having their discussions, and then you get to what we call the aliyahs. Very important term. In any concise history of Israel, you've got to talk about this. And the aliyah is just the Hebrew word for to climb, and it's the Jewish people returning back to Israel from various parts of the world. First from various parts of Europe. They're going to come from the Middle East. They're one of the things about Jewish people, you cannot look at somebody and tell you if they're Jewish or not, because you could be black and you could be Jewish. Yes, you could be white and Jewish. You could be Middle Eastern and Jewish. And so that's one thing that I also tell people all the time. When people go, oh, they're white colonizers. And then I'm like, I look at myself and I'm like, I don't look that way. And so it's just one of those things people say because they're ignorant, of course. But they had these aliyahs, these movements where Jewish people migrated in mass numbers now back into Judea, Israel. And you can see the first aliyah, second aliyah, and these are during the periods when the Ottoman Empire was still in control. Now, one thing that comes up a lot is people say, well, okay, weren't there people there when the Jewish people came back? Yes, there were people who were not Jewish who have been there since, hundreds of years, in some cases even longer. But for the most part, the land the Jewish people did aliyahs back to, for the most part, there are exceptions. In my longer videos, I give all the details and specific numbers on this. For the most part, they went into more barren land. I say Mark Twain because Mark Twain here actually visited the land, and he talked about it as being this barren land. And I'm going to show you a couple pictures here of Tel Aviv, this massive city today. There was nothing there when the aliyahs first took place. And so while, yes, there were some areas where there was an Arab, non-Jewish population that has been there, there were other areas that were completely uninhabited, and that's where most of the Jewish people went. There were some cities that, of course, they were going to commingle, and I'm going to talk about that as well as we go through this and how that became problematic. This is one key person during one of the aliyahs. Just, I can't talk about everybody in this concise history, but still, David Ben-Gurion, he comes in 1906. His life journey is from Poland to Russia to Israel. He becomes the first prime minister of Israel. The airport in Israel, the international airport in Israel, is named after him. So just one key name. If you're just wanting again, the basic concise stuff, if you want more details, longer videos as well. And this is a great picture of Tel Aviv, 1909. So when people say, the Jewish people came back and took land of people, I need to make another video. I haven't done it. But how a lot of the land was acquired was through deals, purchasing the land from Arabs there. They literally just bought the land in many cases. And went into unsettled land. So, this notion that the Jews just came in and displaced a whole bunch of people, made a new country there, kicked everybody out, that's not an honest history. I am going to talk about what happens with the Arab population there because it is important to discuss, but we always have to give everything in the full perspective. And in this concise history, I'm still trying to give enough detail, not as much detail as my longer lectures, but enough where I think it all makes sense. So by 1917, by now we're almost at the end of World War I. The Ottomans are very weak. The British are, of course, very strong. And one of the key things that happens in 1917 is the Balfour Declaration and the San Remo Agreement. So as the Ottomans are declining, Balfour, of course, this guy from England, makes this Balfour Declaration. I'm just going to put my glasses on so I could read this with you, but it's very important. He says, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavor to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of non-existing Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights of political status enjoyed by Jews in other countries. In other words, we believe this land belongs to Israel and the Jewish people, but the non-Jewish people who live there also need to be taken care of in some way, and any Jewish person not coming into Israel can't be treated like crap in other countries, right? And then there was the San Remo Agreement as well, which, as you could read there, reinforces a lot of these ideas. So these were legal documents. People say, these were legal decisions made by international folks, not just one nation. It was, of course, the British, but many other people were involved in these discussions, like the San Remo Agreement. So meanwhile, you have, some conflicts now. So now as the Jewish people start to come in, You'll get in 1920 the Tel Hai Arab fighters crossed into part of the Galilee, confronted a small group of Jewish folks there. People were killed, and then you start to see back and forth fighting starting in the 1920s a bit more. 1922, Winston Churchill, the White Paper. We'll talk more about Churchill in a bit. Supports the idea of Israel, the Jewish plan for Israel for the Jewish people, but there's going to be issues on how many people can come in. And then you can see there are more aliyahs, and in the 1930s, mass migration. Of course, why such a mass migration in the 1930s? Obviously Germany, World War II is not there yet, but we've already had Mein Kampf. 1935, the Nuremberg laws already hitting Germany. And this is one thing, I get this question a lot, is, why didn't even more Jewish people leave Germany? Why didn't they all go to Israel before 1939 in the war? And the reason is, at this point, the British now control this land. So after World War I, the Ottomans lose, the British officially control the land, and the British did limit the number of Jewish people that can come. And it was somewhat difficult because Jewish people wanted to go, they weren't always able to go, and it wasn't that easy for Jewish people to leave Europe at this time. And one of the biggest myths is that I oftentimes say is people say the Holocaust is why Israel was created, and I say no. The Holocaust happened because there was no Israel, because there was no safe haven for the Jewish people with a full army and a full ability to defend themselves to go. They had to still rely on other nations that, of course, wouldn't protect them. If you've studied the Holocaust, very few nations even took any Jewish people in during the Holocaust period. Here's again Churchill again with his quote here, who did believe that the Jewish people should be able to live there, but at the same time, during the Holocaust, there were Britain did bar many Jews from reaching safety. Another important name is 1937, Robert Peel. And Robert Peel, he was one of the first people, I think, to say, let's create a two-state solution, right? And so this is where Robert Peel said, well, we have to create a state for the Arab people, Arab Jewish people. It might be too hard for them to commingle in one state, so let's create two states. And so that was one pretty interesting idea in 1937. But then, of course, World War II breaks out, world gets distracted by World War II, and this is going to be put on the side. A couple things again on World War II, as I mentioned, Cyprus detention camps, so where Jewish people were trying to get out, they weren't able to, a refusal of nations to be able to take Jewish people in, just what I kind of mentioned earlier, but you can see a couple numbers there on this slide here. So I think that's important to understand, that there was no safe haven for the Jewish people, and that is one of the core reasons why the Holocaust is going to happen. All right, and now we get to, I think, one of the most pivotal moments in this whole concise history. And everybody watching, just thank you again for being part of this and watching this. And again, ask questions. If you want to ask questions, put them in the comments. Please do, and I'll try to answer all the questions as they come in. So by 1947, you get the creation of UNSCOP, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. And what it was decided at this point after World War II is, yes, let's try to create a two-state solution. And so this was a serious work where you had a number of nations involved, 11 countries, that are going to look at this land, and they're going to tour the areas. They're going to talk to people, review testimony from the Arabs, from the Jews. They do surveys to know about resources. And the map you see here is the map they proposed. And this idea was that everything you see in green would be a Jewish state, state of Israel. Everything you see in yellow would be a state for the Arab population, right? And this was then put a vote to the entire United Nations at the time. And you could see the vote results here. 33 voted in favor, 13 against, and there were 10 abstentions. And so the nations that generally supported it were the United States and most Western European, Latin American nations. Who opposed it? The Arab states. Now, keep in mind, when this was done, of these nations, Iraq didn't lose any land in the creation of Israel. Lebanon, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, they just did not want a Jewish state there. And I'm going to give you more evidence of that as we go through the wars that are then going to unfold. So this is a key point. So this is the initial map of what was agreed to. The Arab nations said no. Israel went along with this, and of course, in May of 1948, Israel declared its independence. This is Independence Hall in Israel, May 14th, 1948, Independence Day. And just as quickly as independence was declared, the wars began. The War of Independence, 1948, Israel fighting Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Yemen. The countries that, again, attacked Israel did not lose any land before they attacked Israel. In other words, they're not attacking because the UN took land away from them, right? Now, Jordan did want this entire territory, interestingly enough, but at the same time, it wasn't theirs, right? And so at this point, how is this war going to unfold? Well, long story short, and again, in my longer videos, I go through more details on this, but Israel wins. They survive, right? And as a result of the war, you see this new map here, things start to change a bit. And I think most importantly is this. Israel wins. What happens to the land that was supposed to go to the Arab population? The land that today a lot of people call West Bank, Gaza Strip, other people refer to it as Judea, Samaria. That land, Judea and Samaria, or West Bank and East Jerusalem, Israel didn't take over that land. Jordan did. The area of Egypt was taken over by Gaza. The area of Gaza was taken over by Egypt. And so from 1947 until 1967, right, roughly, that territory was not even under Israeli control. And if Israel lost this land, I saw kind of a meme about this once, and it said, if Israel lost the 1948 war, what would Palestine look like today? And all it would look like is a bigger Jordan and a bigger Egypt. Because they had that land and they had no real desire to create an independent state for the Arab population there, for what we refer to as Palestinians today. And so I think that's important to remember because, when you talk about the fighting today and the conflicts today, it's never been about a state for the Arab population. If it was about a state for the Arab population, it would have been solved like that. There were many chances for a state for the Arab population. It was more about Israel not existing. Now, one huge impact of this first war was about 700,000 Arabs did flee. They had to flee. Many were fled because Arab leaders told them to. And in my longer videos, I give the sources on this. I explain this. And others were, through the fighting left and so forth. And so that's one of the things that ends up happening where they ended up going. A lot of them went to Jordan, a lot went to Egypt. And this is, of course, something that for the Arab population, the Palestinians, they've always been upset about is, hey, what happened? Why did we get kicked out? Well, they left assuming they would win the war. They lost the war. And when you lose a war and you flee, it's rare that the other side's going to give you territory, especially if that was the side that was attacked. Then there was another war in 1956. At this point, the president of Egypt was a man named Nasser. There were these various Fedayeen attacks against Israel, these kind of terrorist attacks. And the Suez Canal was seized by Egypt as well from France and England. And so this was an interesting war because it was not Israel alone here. Israel was with England and France against Egypt. At one point, Israel took over the Sinai Peninsula. Eisenhower was a bit upset. He opposed the war because he was kind of kept out of the loop. Meanwhile, Khrushchev is backing Egypt during this war. So at the end of the day, Israel made a lot of advances, but was willing to, again, give up some of this land as long as they could still have access to trade through the Red Sea and other other concessions of like peacekeepers to make sure there were no more attacks from by the Fedayeen into Israel. So all these kind of things were things that Israel were concerned about that were agreed to as a result of the 1956 war. All right. Then we get to one of the more important ones. I went through the 56 war quickly because I want to get to the 67 war. The 1967 war is a game changer because by now these Fedayeen attacks had resumed. These were guerrilla launches across the border race from Gaza into Israel. That upset Israel. And then in May of 1967, Nasser, the president of Egypt, told the UN peacekeepers, leave. Right. And then we also see them, Egypt, Jordan, and Syria all mobilizing their army in May of 1967. And in May of 1967, the Gulf of Aqaba was closed. Nasser did a blockade to Israeli shipping through the Red Sea. So unless you're an idiot, you know that they're planning another attack, right? Remove the peacekeepers, mobilize your army, don't let the trade come in. And the prime minister of Israel at the time, Levi Eshkol, knew something was up. So what's going to happen? Moshe Dayan. Moshe Dayan comes in with an idea. Let's launch a preemptive strike. We know we're going to be attacked any moment. Let's not sit there and get hit. And so Israel strikes at these Arab nations quickly. And you could see the numbers here. And the one I really want you to focus on, just because of time issues here, I don't want to make this video too long, but still pretty detailed, is the aircrafts. And the number of aircrafts the Arabs had was 682. Israel had 286. The first strike by Israel was using their air forces to basically destroy the Egyptian Air Force. And then you look at these numbers again, and you see the total lost, right? And you see aircrafts lost. Israel loses 40. The Arabs lose 444. So pretty dramatic numbers there. And so this is a 6-day war because Israel just demolishes their enemies. This was one of the most brilliant military strategies. Forget what you think about the politics, who's right, who's wrong. I mean, the military element of it is just absolutely dramatically one-sided. And what happens? Well, because Israel wins this war, they take more land. This time, Israel takes the entire Sinai Peninsula, everything you see in that big, huge slot of green there, from Egypt, as well as Gaza, the little strip there just north of the Sinai. They take the entire Golan Heights away from Syria. They take over Judea, Samaria, or the West Bank from Jordan, and East Jerusalem from Jordan. One interesting note is Jordan was told before the war, if you don't invade, we will not take over this territory. Jordan ignored the warning. Jordan invaded. Jordan lost. They lost the territory. And so that was a pivotal moment because now Israel does control land that is, West Bank and Gaza are not territories that were heavily populated by Jewish people. Now, one other important point is that within Israel, there are non-Jewish people who've lived in Israel all this time to this day. The population of Israel includes, I'm not talking about West Bank or Gaza, within Israel today, a couple million Arabs. And you know what? The Arabs who lived inside of Israel today, they serve in the army, they serve in the courts, they go to school side by side with Jewish people. And there's almost no problems, folks, right? And so this kind of blows one of the myths. Oh, Israel's an apartheid state. It's another myth. No, it's quite the opposite. If you talk to people who went through South Africa apartheid, they're usually very offended by that term because they know what real apartheid was. Anyways, after this war, there was a famous conference in Sudan. All these nations went. They did the 3 no's. No peace with Israel, no recognition with Israel, no negotiation with Israel. So they just got their butts handed to them, and they still will refuse to make peace. That was 1967. 1973, there was another war known as the Yom Kippur War. By now, Golda Meir is the prime minister of Israel. I have a short video on her. Sadat is the president of Egypt. The U.S. really did support Israel a lot during this time. There was something called Operation Nickel Glass, provided a lot of aid for Israel. And this was a long, bloody war. Really, it was bad on all sides, right? And not much changes hands, but something important happened. Sadat had an epiphany. After the 73 war, he began to realize Israel's not going anywhere and we need to make peace. And so he does. Sadat finally decides to make peace with the Jewish people in Israel. 1978, Camp David, he makes peace. After he makes peace with Israel, Israel agrees to give the entire Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. Now, folks, when in history, and you could do this on a search engine, when in history has a nation been attacked, wins the war, takes land, and gives it back, and the only thing they ask for return is recognition? That's what Israel wanted. They wanted Egypt to recognize Israel's right to exist, which they did. Sadat, you can see in this other image here, several years later was assassinated. Why was he assassinated? Because he dared make peace with the Jewish people. So pretty important moment, but it also shows that Israel is willing to make peace with its neighbors, give up land even with its neighbors for the simple peace of mind and recognition. So since then, 1980s until today, and again, my longer videos have a lot more detail on this. There were more attempts for peace now with the Arabs living in Gaza and West Bank and so forth, the Palestinians. There were, of course, the Intifada attacks in the 1980s. And for those of you who don't know what that word is, Intifada were terrorist attacks, folks. They were bus bombings, cafe bombings, targeting civilians, going on buses, strapping on bombs on yourself, suicide bombers. They would go in a bus, blow themselves up. These were the things that were happening inside of Israel. And obviously, this was beyond problematic and concerning. And between 1990 and 2003, there were various talks, right? Yitzhak Rabin made agreement with Yasser Arafat. Yasser Arafat was a man who led the PLO for a very long time. In my longer videos, again, more detail on all of him. But Yasser Arafat, as we're going to see, turns out to never really wanted peace. He wanted money. He had opportunities for a full Palestinian state, turned it down. This initial image was the first agreement between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin that they'll work on a roadmap to create a state for the Palestinians and all of that. There's a whole long story behind this image in my longer video. And then Rabin was assassinated by a fanatic in Israel, right, who opposed his attempts at peace. Now, one big difference. When Sadat was assassinated, people in the Arab world oftentimes cheered. When Rabin was assassinated in Israel, there was nothing but mourning in Israel. And I think that's an important point as well to remember. Various conferences, 1998, 2000 Camp David is an important one, because by the 2000 Camp David, Clinton was president of the United States, Ehud Barak was the prime minister of Israel, and Arafat was still in power. And Ehud Barak, and there's an amazing, very powerful video by Bill Clinton, if you want to try to look it up, where he talked about this, and he was just at a loss because Barak and Israel gave everything to the Palestinians you could want. They literally gave them the West Bank, Gaza, continuous connection between them, East Jerusalem even. And Arafat said no. And not only did Arafat say no, he then ignited the Second Intifada. And when the Second Intifada took place, Israel at that point started to take a more hard-nosed approach to dealing with the various terrorist attacks. And in my longer videos, again, I talk about all that. And for a while, Israel just went really hard into Gaza, really hard into the West Bank. But that lasted for a few years. And in 2005, Israel left Gaza. And again, they left Gaza with an agreement that no more terrorist attacks, right? So in terms of the timeline, you have the 2000 Camp David, those fall apart. Then after that, you get the Second Intifada. Then you get the Israel cracking down really hard. And then Israel leaves Gaza. And then 2010-7, of course, that horrific attack, the most violent attack against Jewish people since the Holocaust. And that was when, as I'm recording this now, Israel's still dealing with trying to get Hamas out of the area, eliminating Hamas from Gaza, because in terms of Israel's perspective, there is no way you could ever make peace when Hamas is still there, launching this massive attack. So, my longer videos, again, go into all the nuance on this, and I really encourage you to watch it because that's the only way to understand it. This is just a quick explanation, but there's much more detail to all of this. Taking us to my last slide here. And this last slide is really this modern marvels that I wanted to talk about, because we started with the ancient roots, we end in the modern marvels, because Israel's story is amazing. It's been around for thousands of years, right? The Jewish people today are 0.2% of the population. They've won 20% of Nobel Prizes. And since the creation of Israel, they have done amazing things. Water desalination. They take deserts and make them into oases. Obviously, the Iron Dome technology, the USB flash drive. They are world leaders in cybersecurity and medicine, the diamond industry. And one of the more interesting things I'll leave you with here is they're one of the happiest people in the world. Even though they're surrounded by many nations that want to destroy them, poll after poll after poll, Jewish people in Israel are happy. And I think that has a lot to do with community. And, why are Jewish people successful? It is community. It is values. I have other videos on why is there anti-Semitism throughout history. And again, I really do hope that as you've watched all this, you have this concise history, but I also hope you're motivated to learn more. To do, maybe go through my playlist here and look at these other things. And if you have questions, again, leave them in the comments here, leave them in the comments in the other videos. And I hope you found this interesting. It's about 50 minutes here, so my goal was to keep this under an hour. And so hopefully you enjoyed that, you learned a lot. And share this video with as many people as you can. Like I said, I want this to be a resource for many people to watch and learn from. All right, everyone, thank you, especially all of you who just watched the whole thing, and just keep learning and questions, and I'm happy to keep teaching this stuff. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thank you for watching.